Members of the Biafran Liberation Army were asked by Orsu community leaders to vacate their camps in the forests of Orsu in Imo State, after persistent confrontations with the local vigilante group. The vigilante group from Orsu, fed up with continued insecurity, mobilized and entered the forest areas where the Biafran Liberation Army fighters had camped for a long time. The people of Orsu made it clear that they no longer support the Biafra agitation if this is how it will be achieved, and demanded the exit of anyone pushing the agenda from their community. They stated that they need peace and not war or conflict, and if Biafra cannot be actualized through non-violent means, then they are no longer interested in the agitation. In response, the Biafran Liberation Army decided to withdraw peacefully to avoid intra-community violence, especially against fellow Igbos who no longer aligned with the struggle. Reports suggest that the vigilantes may have also taken over the main mother camp of the Biafran Liberation Army in Orsu, although this information remains unconfirmed. Local residents said they had abandoned their community for nearly 4 years due to instability, but have now returned and are reclaiming their lands and roads. Public opinion on social media is divided, with some celebrating the vigilantes' actions, while others lament the loss of a protective force that stood against Fulani herders and kidnappers. However, some critics have emphasized the need for Igbo unity in the face of external threats and calls for internal peace, regardless of political or ideological alignment. In the quiet, lush and hilly terrain of Orsu, a community in Imo State located in the southeastern region of Nigeria, something extraordinary unfolded that has caught the attention of both supporters and critics of the Biafran movement across the world. For nearly 4 years, the forests of Orsu had been occupied by members of the Biafran Liberation Army, a group that identified itself as the militant arm of the Biafra struggle. These men, clad in black uniforms and often armed, had declared the dense bushes of Orsu their operational base in the ongoing agitation for an independent Biafran nation. But everything changed when the people of Orsu, led by local vigilante groups and elders of the community, decided they had seen enough. The beginning of this dramatic chapter was not sudden. For many in Orsu, the initial presence of the Biafran Liberation Army was tolerated, even welcomed. It was seen as a shield against threats coming from outside their homeland. In a time when herdsman attacks, kidnappings and road robberies had made traveling through Imo State a terrifying ordeal, the arrival of the Biafran Liberation Army seemed like divine intervention to some. These men claimed they had come not to fight their own people, but to protect Igbo land from invaders and to push for freedom. They built camps deep inside the forests, raised flags bearing the rising sun, and set up checkpoints that became symbols of Biafran defiance. At first, many youths in the community even joined them, lured by the passion, the promise of justice, and the idea of standing up for a cause that reminded them of their ancestors' cry for self-determination during the Nigerian Civil War. But as months rolled into years, the reality of life under the presence of a militant group began to sink in. The peace the people had hoped for began to erode, and insecurity, ironically, became a permanent guest in Orsu. At first, many youths in the community even joined them, lured by the passion, the promise of justice, and the idea of standing up for a cause that reminded them of their ancestors' cry for self-determination during the Nigerian Civil War. But as months rolled into years, the reality of life under the presence of a militant group began to sink in. The peace the people had hoped for began to erode, and insecurity, ironically, became a permanent guest in Orsu. In the middle of all this, a group of local vigilantes began to organize. Unlike the heavily armed Biafran Liberation Army, these were ordinary villagers, farmers, hunters, retired civil servants, armed only with hunting rifles, charms, and the courage born out of desperation. They called themselves defenders of Orsu, and their message was clear: their village must not be turned into a battlefield. What started as a few men patrolling footpaths soon grew into a full community-backed force. They knew the terrain, they knew the people, and they knew their enemy was no longer foreign. It was in the last week of June 2025 that everything came to a boiling point. The vigilante group, backed by irate villagers who had returned home after years in exile, moved into the forest in a coordinated operation. The mission was not to kill, they said, but to reclaim what was theirs. Eyewitnesses described the scene as intense but non-violent. The vigilantes marched through the trees, shouting the names of their ancestors, calling upon the spirits of the land to rise and restore peace. There were chants, drumming, and traditional prayers. The Biafran Liberation Army fighters, who had expected such a move eventually, reportedly decided not to engage in combat. They began to withdraw. One of the elders, whose name is Chief Linus Okafor, said he had never witnessed anything like it. He told journalists that the community made its final decision after a series of town hall meetings where mothers cried, youths complained of fear, and the aged begged for peace. He said they had reached out to the leaders of the Biafran Liberation Army through intermediaries, warning them that the time to leave had come. "We are not saying Biafra is a bad idea," he said. "We are saying that war is a bad method. If this Biafra must be born, let it be born in peace, not in blood." The Biafran Liberation Army, in a surprising but wise move, announced their peaceful withdrawal. One of their spokesmen, whose voice was played on local radio, said they were not cowards but would not shed Igbo blood. He said their fight was against oppression, not their own people. He accused some local and foreign elements of sowing discord among Biafrans and warned that history would judge those who turn their backs on the struggle. But in the end, they packed up their belongings and began moving out of the camps. There were reports that the vigilantes took over what had been known as the Mother Camp, the central base of the Biafran Liberation Army in the Orsu forests. Photographs shared on social media showed burnt flags, scattered boots, and abandoned tents. While this information remains partly unconfirmed, the images fueled heated debates online. Some hailed it as a brave stand by a community tired of being used. Others wept at what they called the end of a stronghold against Fulani herdsmen and government-backed terror. Social media exploded with reactions. On one side were the voices of those like Uche Madu, a teacher in Enugu, who posted that Orsu had set an example of courage. He praised the vigilantes for restoring order and called on other communities to rise against non-state armed actors. On the other side were people like Ngozi Ezeokafor, a nurse in Aba, who said the vigilantes had betrayed the Igbo cause. She asked, "Who will now defend us when the government fails?" The division did not stop online. Within Orsu itself, families became split. Some fathers scolded their sons for joining the vigilantes. Some mothers wept that their sons had fled the Biafran Liberation Army camps and returned home hungry and ashamed. Local churches called for reconciliation services. Traditional rulers began holding private meetings to ensure that the departure of the Biafran Liberation Army did not create new enemies among the people. Despite the tension, one thing became clear. The people of Orsu were reclaiming their home. Roads that had been blocked by armed checkpoints were opened. Farmlands that had grown wild under the watchful eye of armed men were being cleared again. Young men began repairing their family homes. Women swept the market square and sang songs of hope. Children who had lived in other towns returned with their parents to touch the soil of their ancestry. The situation in Orsu opened a new chapter in the Biafra agitation. For many years, the movement had suffered internal disagreements, splits among leaders, and accusations of betrayal. But this was different. This was the people themselves saying, "Enough." Not because they had stopped believing in justice, not because they had suddenly fallen in love with the Nigerian government, but because they had grown tired of fear. It was a reminder that no revolution can thrive without the backing of the people it claims to defend. As expected, various Biafran groups began to issue statements. Some blamed Orsu's leaders for being influenced by government bribes. Others accused the vigilantes of working with enemies of the movement. But some called for reflection. One Biafran activist in the United Kingdom, whose name is Kingsley Duru, said in a live broadcast that the time had come to rethink the struggle. He asked, "If our people no longer feel safe in our presence, then what are we fighting for?" In the midst of all this, security experts began analyzing what the development meant for the larger southeast region. Some feared that the withdrawal of the Biafran Liberation Army would create a vacuum that could be exploited by criminal gangs or external invaders. Others said it showed the strength of community-based solutions and the power of people-driven peace processes. A few even argued that the federal government should learn from Orsu and work with local leaders instead of relying solely on military crackdowns. But for the people of Orsu, the matter is personal. They are not thinking about policy documents or televised debates. They are thinking about how to sleep at night without the sound of gunfire. They are thinking about how to send their children back to school. They are thinking about harvesting cassava and celebrating Christmas without looking over their shoulders. One woman, whose name is Felicia Nwosu, shared her experience with a local journalist. She said her son was only 8 years old when the conflict started. He had grown up afraid of trees because that was where the soldiers hid. He had never attended a proper school. But since the vigilantes drove out the armed men, she said he had begun playing outside again. He no longer screams when he hears a loud sound, she said. That is what peace looks like. Even though peace has returned in some form, it is still fragile. The withdrawal of the Biafran Liberation Army did not erase the anger many people feel toward the Nigerian state. Roads are still bad. Electricity is still erratic. The promises of good governance are still empty. But Orsu's message is not about surrender. It is about sanity. It is about choosing to fight with words, with protests, with legal instruments, and not with guns inside their villages. The story of Orsu may one day be written in history books as a turning point. Not because it ended the Biafran dream, but because it reminded everyone involved that the heart of the struggle must always be the people. If the people say they are afraid, then the strategy must change. If the people say they want peace, then every fighter must listen. As the dust settles over the forests of Orsu, and the songs of mothers welcoming back their children fill the air, one can only hope that this new chapter leads to deeper conversations. Conversations about justice, about identity, about safety, and about unity. For now, Orsu has spoken. Whether others will listen remains to be seen. But what is clear is that peace, once forgotten, has returned. And in a land that has tasted too much blood, that is no small victory. The days that followed the withdrawal of the Biafran Liberation Army from the forests of Orsu were filled with a strange mix of relief, confusion, sadness, and cautious hope. The local people, for the first time in years, could walk on their own footpaths without being questioned by men in black with rifles slung across their shoulders. The sound of guns, once a nightly terror, was replaced by the gentle voices of returning villagers and the rustle of machetes clearing overgrown bushes. But underneath the surface calm, there remained a powerful sense of unfinished business, because while the Biafran fighters had physically left, the emotional wounds they left behind had not. Children who had grown up thinking that soldiers in the forest were part of life now had to be gently taught that what they had experienced was not normal. Their parents too were relearning what freedom felt like. It is one thing to dream of liberation. It is another thing to live under a constant state of emergency. Orsu had learned that lesson the hard way. The village elders, especially the council of Ndinze and Ozo, began meeting more frequently in the town hall. Their discussions were no longer about how to survive, but how to rebuild. One major issue they debated was how to welcome back all those who had joined the Biafran Liberation Army or had supported it during its stay in the forest. Some wanted to shame them publicly. Others argued that they were only misguided youths who believed in a cause and needed guidance, not punishment. After long deliberations, the elders reached a wise conclusion. They would organize a cleansing ritual, not to embarrass anyone, but to purify the land and make way for a new beginning. The cleansing ceremony was led by Chief Augustine Nanachi, one of the oldest men in Orsu and a spiritual custodian of their ancestral shrine. Women danced in circles, carrying calabashes filled with palm wine and kola nuts. The village masquerade, called Ijele, emerged from the sacred grove and danced through the square for the first time in years. It was a powerful sight that brought tears to many eyes. Those who had fled returned quietly, standing in the shadows, watching the community reclaim its soul. Meanwhile, outside Orsu, the story was attracting wider attention. Local media outlets in Imo State began sending correspondents to cover the situation. Channels Television and the Sun newspaper ran headlines about the community's decision to drive out the Biafran fighters. The Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation aired a special segment highlighting the bravery of the vigilantes. The Imo state government issued a cautious statement commending the community for choosing peace and promising to support rehabilitation efforts. But many locals met this promise with skepticism, saying that it was the government's failure to provide security in the first place that created the conditions for the Biafran Liberation Army to take root. The development also stirred controversy among Biafran activists at home and abroad. In Germany, a pro-Biafra rally scheduled for July was quickly overshadowed by arguments over what had happened in Orsu. Some accused the leaders of the Biafran Liberation Army of failing to maintain discipline within their ranks. Others insisted that the withdrawal was part of a greater plan to reorganize and come back stronger. In Finland, Simon Nyoku Ekpa, a prominent Biafran advocate, was asked about the situation during a live broadcast. He avoided direct condemnation of the Orsu people, but warned that the struggle for Biafra was entering a delicate phase. He said every community must choose whether they want to be part of history or enemies of it. The events in Orsu also revealed the painful dilemma many Igbos are facing. On one hand, there is a deep hunger for justice, freedom, and a better life, which many believe only Biafra can provide. On the other hand, there is an increasing fear that the method of achieving that dream may destroy the very people it seeks to liberate. This internal conflict is tearing through families, churches, and social media platforms. In Onitsha, a popular Catholic priest, Reverend Father Chukwuma Ezionu, gave a homily that echoed the hearts of many. He said, If your freedom makes your neighbor a refugee, then that freedom has become oppression. His words were shared widely online, igniting fresh conversations among young Biafrans who are now rethinking the way forward. One former Biafran fighter who had returned home spoke anonymously to a reporter from Owerri. He said he joined the movement because he believed in the dream of a better Igbo land. But over time, he said, he saw how power began to corrupt the leaders of the camp. He described how some commanders treated locals with disdain and how internal disagreements often led to brutal punishments. "We lost the love we started with," he said. "Now I just want to farm again. I want to marry. I want peace." Many who once supported the presence of the Biafran Liberation Army now admit that their patience was worn thin by the never-ending cycle of fear. The mothers were especially vocal. In Orsu Central Primary School, which is now being cleared for reopening, a group of women met under the mango tree and talked openly about their experiences. One of them, whose name is Madam Ifeoma Nadi, shared how her daughter was almost forced into marriage by a commander because she was considered a symbol of Biafran purity. Her story shocked even the local journalist covering the meeting. Another woman said she watched her husband flogged for refusing to surrender his last goat to feed the fighters in the forest. Many who once supported the presence of the Biafran Liberation Army now admit that their patience was worn thin by the never-ending cycle of fear. The mothers were especially vocal. In Orsu Central Primary School, which is now being cleared for reopening, a group of women met under the mango tree and talked openly about their experiences. One of them, whose name is Madam Ifeoma Nadi, shared how her daughter was almost forced into marriage by a commander because she was considered a symbol of Biafran purity. Her story shocked even the local journalist covering the meeting. Another woman said she watched her husband flogged for refusing to surrender his last goat to feed the fighters in the forest. Samson Iruegbunam and his team have now turned their attention to community development. They are working with carpenters and masons to rebuild damaged homes. They are helping farmers reclaim bushy lands and encouraging youths to attend vocational training in nearby towns. Their message is that of hope, not revenge. They have also reached out to churches and mosques to organize peace meetings, ensuring that what happened will not lead to new cycles of division. The Nigerian police, who for years were too afraid to enter Orsu, have suddenly returned. Patrol vehicles were spotted driving through main roads, often greeted with silence. Many villagers remain suspicious of their presence. One elder said the police had come to celebrate after the real work had been done. There is growing pressure on the state government to recognize the vigilantes as a legitimate local security force and to provide them with funding and training. International human rights observers have also taken notice. A representative from Amnesty International, who visited Imo State last week, said that Orsu's story is both a tragedy and a lesson. She said the Nigerian government must learn to invest in community-led peace initiatives instead of relying solely on force. She also warned that the underlying grievances that gave birth to groups like the Biafran Liberation Army have not been addressed. For now, Orsu is trying to return to normal life. Market stalls are reopening, weddings are being planned. The village square is once again alive with the sound of children laughing. But behind every smile is a memory of what was lost. Years of education, broken families, and young men buried in shallow graves in the forest. The community knows it will take time to heal. As July approaches, many believe that Orsu's bold move may inspire other communities in the southeast. Already, there are reports that a village in Anambra State is considering a similar step. Activists are calling for a Southeast Peace Summit where all stakeholders, traditional rulers, youth leaders, religious heads, and even former fighters can meet and discuss a new path for the region. The big question remains: can the dream of Biafra survive without guns? Can it be redefined through democratic engagement, cultural revival, economic empowerment, and strategic dialogue? Orsu has given an answer through action, not theory. And their answer is yes, it must be possible. In the coming months, the world will be watching what becomes of this brave community, whether their peace holds, whether their courage spreads, whether their story is celebrated or forgotten.
That one said never the powerful again. I used to go to Nabucco to transform it. One more. I'm only going to send too much. Bara kita na transforma itu pa. Ya bayan. Watch. Na mukaga na kwa umwalo ihitokwa.
Biafra, I don't know if Biafra, Biafra.
Agane bao. Aga magania.
Go, you know, like GPR nanga. And I homo.
All the far na where by all the far. Let my the Damantonga, I don't know. Udodi.
nna m kwu ebe a nọ ya kịta bụ ụmụalụ is na ụmụalụ ehite ụkwa ebe a nọ ya na ibe nke onye agbapụla ọkwa anyị gara ebe a mgbe anụ a sị ngị ya lide anyị Hadi sinna. Entrance be Fridalin na Nabu. Oh, entrance dia kain no kita. Liuran Nabu kain no. Iya bu entrance be Nabu. Hah? Today? Today? Yes. Change the mother. Come down. Yeah, entrance Ben Nabubu. Well, man, yeah. Say
This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.